As the dying embers of the Cannan administration gently cool, the Chief Minister joins us to look back at the past 5 years. We regularly hear the phrase, "this is the worst government we've ever had," trotted out in the run-up to possibly the last 4 elections. But is that true? Mr Cannan joins me now in the studio. At the end of a 5-year term as Chief Minister, so maybe if we begin by you describing to us the highlights.
I think one has to put the whole 5 years into the context of what has been going on around us. And I know we've gone through this a few times over the last few years when we've been discussing the latest policy issues. But the island, the public, businesses, the community has not only had to find its way through and out of the coronavirus pandemic, set in train from a government perspective, an economic recovery programme attached to that, but almost immediately be plunged into all the impacts of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the inflation, the impacts on mortgages, the impact on the cost of living as a whole. And then, that whole sort of drama around that has gone on for, in total, nearly 2.5, 3 years. It's sort of soaked up the first 3 years of this government in its intensity. And now, and even today, we're still now sort of feeling the reverberations, and perhaps they've been multiplied again by what's going on in Iran. So, the whole squeeze and impacts that people have felt, and the arguments we've had, and the debates we've had around things, policies the government has been following at the particular time, living wages, for example, and the veracity of those debates, and ferocity at times indeed, to come to the position where we are, where I think actually the changes that I made at the beginning of the year in terms of the personnel and the impact on policies and the budget that we've delivered, I feel as if we're in a calmer space now. A lot of the challenges are there. There are clearly significant issues and policy decisions that are not, currently being debated, that will carry on through to the next administration. So when you think about then what we've been through and where we are, unemployment below 1%. We're delivering on brownfield sites, and perhaps delivering more on brownfield sites in the last 5 years than governments have for the last 20 years. That we are, enhancing and delivering on commitments made around border security. That we are tackling some of the waiting list issues. That actually the foundations are in place for us to build out into the future. But it is, I think I put this into the context that we need to also consider all the influences that are impacting on our island at the moment from an external perspective, in terms, and realising the impact that they have, in order to really fundamentally understand how government is acting, what policies are needed, and what the substance of and influences that we need to think about in terms of delivering future policy of relevance.
One of the things that became more evident to me after I was thrown out of politics, but it was probably something I was aware of during my time in Council of Ministers, it was how, when it came to it, the really big factors that influence particularly the economy of the Isle of Man in this case are largely things that you have very little control over. Interest rates, wars taking place in different countries, the decisions being taken by large multinational corporations, or indeed organisations like the OECD or European Union, which was much more influential over us during my time before we'd all left the European Union. All these things are big influences, and actually, when it comes to it, the levers of power available to Isle of Man government aren't that great in terms of countering some of these things.
No, we do not have control over monetary policy, which can fundamentally alter the progress or otherwise of an economy. But we do have fiscal control over our own, financial position, and the point is I guess that if you run an international economy, if you want to be an international island, if you want to be a self-governing nation, these external influences play quite a significant role in terms of how you then conduct your governance, if you like, what sort of fiscal policies that you can bring in. And bear in mind, for taxation, for example, there are certain rules and regulations that will govern how taxation, for example, is applied fairly to corporations. And you will have, in your time, gone through that with the sort of 0-10 policy as a government that you followed at that particular time. And of course, will guide the way and force perhaps the way sometimes that you have to regulate in certain areas, even if that regulation potentially will squeeze or put pressure on certain elements of the economy. So yes, it is governing on the island can be complex, and is influenced from external forces, and some of those influences aren't always seen that much in terms of sort of public recognition, but of course they do impact the work that's being done within government, the legislation that has been forward, the regulation that's being brought forward, and of course ultimately do have an impact on the ground, and whether that is in business or whether that is in the community. So yes, of course, it's complex. But then again, many other nations around the world and countries around the world, of course, have similar influences, in whether that's foreign policy or whether they're signed up to certain agreements, or choose to align politically with other countries. There are influences, and the EU particularly is a very good example of rules and regulations being brought forward and applied to countries, whether or not they completely agree with them.
Do you think your government has been good enough in bringing the public along with it on this fairly rocky road of a journey that we've had over the last 5 years?
Well, I think there's always going to be room for improvement. Of course, always with public engagement. I think it's been hard, Phil. I mean, I don't shy away from it. I think particularly those first 3-4 years were very, very difficult. And when I think about the platform and the circumstances that we've been through in terms of what I've just discussed and the pressures that brought, and then throw in some of the policies that we and Tynwald had chosen to pursue, and influence that we were trying to bring over sort of public finances, and the impact that was having, I think it was quite an attritional and difficult period. And of course, I think when people's finances are being squeezed the way they have over the last 5 years, there's going to be a lot of frustrations. And that's why I took the decisions, as I said at the beginning of the year, that I felt were absolutely necessary to release some of those pressures in our community.
And those decisions specifically that we're talking about encouraging two of your ministers to spend more time in the garden.
Yeah, correct. But also, I think when you look at the makeup of Tynwald as well, there's no question in my mind that actually, consensus and finding consensus has been very hard, and that there has been a strong spine in Tynwald that perhaps has been further left of the political curve than you would perhaps have otherwise expected. I think Alex Allinson said to me, "Well, it's not helpful to term it left and right," but I think somehow there does have to be an explanation given. Or an interpretation given as to why perhaps there's been more fractious debate in Tynwald, and why actually there hasn't been a lot of unity around some of the policies that have been brought forward. But then again, I guess that's politics, and also then again, this government, perhaps more than any other, has faced some of the most challenging economic circumstances in the last 5 years. For decades, possibly. Even when you go back to Alan Bell's time, and of course you were part of that government, and it was a difficult time. I think it was probably more of an austerity programme. Understandably, £200 million of VAT had gone. nevertheless, I think, and that did bring, of course, it brought its challenges and brought its difficulties. I think this time it's been very different in terms of perhaps arguably of the complexities of these economic challenges, but measured in terms of the pound in the pocket and the diminishing value of that pound. I think that's why perhaps the public has expressed the frustrations that it has, and why government in dealing with difficult circumstances has perhaps not connected in many ways. But I don't think it's going to get that much easier into the future. But that's perhaps some of the reasoning as to why maybe those first few years were as difficult as they were.
You have famously said that it is not as easy perhaps as people might think being Chief Minister, in as much as you have certain powers, but you don't have, well, certainly thanks to changes in terms of the way in which members get paid, which were introduced 5 years ago, it's more difficult to influence the behaviour of members of Tynwald. We have a situation that's fairly evident now across the water in the UK, where we had a Prime Minister who wasn't particularly good at communicating, maybe was quite a competent Prime Minister, replaced by someone who appears, at least, and let's be honest, he's only had a few weeks in the role, appears to be much better at communicating his ideas. And it does seem that communication is pretty key to all of this.
Oh, well, I agree, and absolutely recognise that. I mean, Donald Trump is pretty good at communicating, but then again, not many people agree with a lot of what he says. So I don't think there's a perfect answer. Look, I mean, when I apply it again, to Tynwald, and if you're talking about that communication and trying to identify why perhaps you haven't, it's not just communicating with the public. I think it's getting that public support and that sense of public support for the direction of travel. And there's no question, as I said, in my mind, it's been difficult to get consensus in Tynwald. I think, I certainly tried at the very beginning to be quite wide-ranging in terms of trying to bring people together across the political spectrum. But clearly that became harder and harder as time went on, and particular policies and particular views came into conflict with my own, and naturally that also contributed to some turnover in the ministerial cycle as well.
I mean, do you think sometimes, because it's always been the case that chief ministers, knowing that nobody's elected with a clear electoral mandate to go in and run the country in a particular way, every individual has to come in, and the collective voice needs to be heard and understood, and then a government formed based on the collective view of Tynwald, which, as you've quite accurately, I think, described, there has been a very strong factional divide between perhaps people on the left of centre and people on the right of centre in this Tynwald. In all previous iterations of council ministers, chief ministers have tried to bring all the views together. What you appear to have decided in the last year of your administration is that actually maybe that's not working as well as it should, and I need a different approach.
Well, I think that's fair to say, and judging the timing to sort of throw it all in, if you like, is been tricky. There's been no question about that. Look, let's not get too depressed about it. I mean, at the end of the day, we have come together. We have been cohesive. I think the island infrastructure scheme and the brownfield site delivery, for example, was a good example. I think the health recovery in terms of post-COVID restoration programme was a good example of collective working. I think most people have been supportive of enhancing our policing and our security, merging ports and policing, regular policing, for example, the announcements around increased border security that we've brought forward, the tightening of immigration, the delivery of the quality assurance scheme in the schools. There has been a lot achieved. But on some of the core, particularly the core fiscal issues, there's been clear disagreement and diversion. And as I say, I think that frustration in terms of that policy delivery and the impact that it's having on an already pressed community and already hard-pressed business and economic sector, then, that causes quite significant political split. So I wouldn't paint an entirely negative picture, but I agree. I think, with the sort of external influence mix thrown into potentially quite politically divided, strongly politically divided House of Keys as well, and some of the policies that we've driven as headline policies, then I think it has been at times potentially quite frustrating and difficult. And so therefore ultimately there had to be a divergence and a divergence point. That still doesn't mean to say there were not some useful points of cohesion and collectiveness that have not been, delivered, because there absolutely have. And I think, whichever side of the coin you've been on, we will probably get agreement that there have been some positive steps forward.
Has Tynwald stopped talking to each other? Have Tynwald members stopped talking to each other in the way perhaps that many think that they should? Because ultimately, as a politician, your achievements can be greater if you have got buy-in from everybody. So you talk to people, you work with people, you have those conversations behind the scenes, so that when it comes to Tynwald, actually discussions and debates in Tynwald, you've got a pretty good idea where everyone stands on everything. Now, certainly what I hear of this last 5 years is those conversations perhaps don't happen as frequently. Members don't sit around talking about politics in the way that perhaps they might have done over a coffee in the members' lounge. Is that fair, or would you argue otherwise?
Well, I think I probably would argue otherwise, in that the Tynwalds that I have been in generally have diverged on a lot of issues, and whether there has been this sort of Team Tynwald promotion going on, in the end it doesn't always come together. Look, I've never been a big believer in Club Tynwald or Team Tynwald. I think what I have been a believer in is that we should reach agreement, coalesce around the policies and deliver on those. But often it does need hard debate, and I think the public expect hard debate, and they expect representative views to be put forward. But ultimately, because of the system of politics that we run, we do have to reach some agreement as to the way forward, and it's not always easy just to sort things out over a cup of tea. And neither would I personally expect it. I would rather people got onto the floor and argued their case, and you convinced Tynwald as to the merits of the case, or you didn't convince them to the merits of that case. And I do think politics does require some tough discussions.
And one place in which those tough discussions were happening, which was a new thing, an innovation from your government, was the government conferences. Well, I don't know. You tell me. What would you say about those? Were they a success, failure, good idea, worth repeating? Where would you assess those?
Well, we tried a number of different methods to try and increase engagement. The conferences did, I think, bring some value. Perhaps they didn't reach as broader public audience as one wanted them to, but understandably finding the right timing to deliver those conferences It's not always easy, but I do think they provided a chance for ministers to explain public policy, to engage with an audience, and to take away from that some ideas about how that policy should be shaped. This government also brought forward a requirement for all departments to produce an annual report to Tynwald, for example, on the idea that that report would be debated and Tynwald would help shape the contribution of the policy and delivery and other aspects of departmental performance. I don't think, despite doing that I believe we got the kind of scrutiny and debate that I was hoping for on a consolidated basis. But so, I mean, when I was Treasury Minister, we did a number of round the island roadshows. In fact, we've had the Coman roadshow over the last 5 years. So we have made a strong attempt to reach out to the public, but also accept people live very busy lives. They haven't always got time to fit in with the government or the Council of Ministers timetable, and part of the job obviously goes to the individual politician and the way they reach out to their constituents, the events they go to, the support they give constituents on an individual basis, and that of course should all feed into the big pot of delivering the policies and representation that the individual MHK is also bringing to the table in order to reach I hope the right collective decision.
Social media is certainly there are two ways of looking at it, maybe several ways of looking at it. It's a great opportunity for people, particularly politicians, to be able to get messages to their public. It also, though, is a great way of people to reinforce their views, opinions, prejudices against certain things. And certainly, if you look at social media, Isle of Man government is getting it in the neck on a fairly regular basis these days. Is government doing enough to engage on social media, and is it even possible, do you think, to sort of shift the dial in terms of that community engagement, which I suspect is going to have a significant influence in September with the general election?
Well, yeah, I mean, social media, it's here. It's here to stay. I think people address that and the way they use it in a number of different ways. I think absolutely, the government has to put forward its case and use social media for its announcements. I think on an individual basis, I think different MHKs will seek to address the use of social media in their own way. What I would say, though, is that social media is just but one forum. Actually, I find quite a lot there can be some very hard, strong views expressed on social media, which you might think are representative across the island. And actually, when I stop to talk to my constituents, that's not always the case. In fact, there's far more nuanced views. So, I don't think that we should be obsessed with social media. It's a forum, but a lot of people have alternative views. They often won't go onto social media because they don't like to argue against the general flow of the conversation. And of course, we know social media at times can be pretty horrible place to be, and people often don't hold back in some of their commentary. And so, look, it's a forum. It's not the only forum. There's lots of people out there who want to engage with government, but want to do that either on a face-to-face basis, through constituency surgeries perhaps, or through meetings, or just by simply having the opportunity to collar their MHK in the street and having a few words with them.
Was it a mistake, do you think, to have had such a churn in terms of the personalities in Isle of Man government? So, I mean, the only real constant has been yourself as Chief Minister, possibly Jane Poole-Wilson as Deputy. There have been those that have suggested that in a time of economic and international turmoil, having internal regular changes of face, both in terms of ministers and chief executives, maybe wasn't the wisest of moves?
Well, each circumstance was different, and decisions were made at the time. I mean, bear in mind, at least 2 or 3 of those core moves I didn't really have a choice over. In other words, the ministers decided themselves, for whatever reason, that they were going to stand down from their role. So they weren't necessarily all enforced decisions, but each circumstance was different. It was, as I said, had to bear in mind this wasn't just a smooth, ordinary, inverted commas, government without huge external pressures or fluctuations in interest rates or mortgage costs going up, cost of living crisis, etc., as we've already discussed. So, these were quite abnormal sets of pressures that we've been facing, and within that, I think that translated to some of the pressures that individual ministers were feeling, and I would have been feeling as chief minister. And clearly, at least on 3 or 4 of those occasions, fundamentally disagreed with the way forward that was being put forward in terms of the direction of travel. And it falls to me to make the hardest choice of all, but often the only one that is available as chief minister, and that's to change the course by replacing the minister. So, look, of course, it's been a mixed bag. It's not ideal. Of course, you want a consolidated government and a core government, to stay for an extended period of time. But as I say, I think when you compare the last 5 years to what's gone on before, and arguably, but I would say that the hardest thing of all, the pound in the pocket and the diminishing value of that pound, and the impacts on people's lives, and also government as well, and government finances and government expenditure, and couple that with a desire to achieve, then, yes, at times it's been clearly difficult. I mean, no pleasure at all from ministerial churn, but sometimes you also have to make decisions to keep the show on the road and keep things going in the direction that you believe is the right one.
And of course, you were trying to mouth to me there, and it wasn't picking up Claire Barber being the other constant in council ministers.
Well, to be fair, I mean, I think when you look at it, actually, most of the people there at the beginning are also there at the end. Tim Crookall, David Ashford, Jane Paul Wilson, Claire Barber. I think there has been a core. Of course, there's been some movements around for various reasons, but still fundamentally, there has been a core of stability. I would argue again a core of stability through some of the roles in council of ministers, which has enabled me, of course, to be able to do the things that I've needed to do, and I'm grateful for the support that's been shown in that respect.
When you established the Housing and Communities Board, did you expect more from it?
Look, we have built houses. I think actually the most successful house building scheme has been through the Island Infrastructure Scheme, the brownfield site delivery, which has enabled the private sector to build houses. And not only that, there's been other house building programs through the private sector that have been followed. I think government's progress in this area has been limited. I'll be honest, it hasn't achieved what I wanted. I think there were policies which I shall talk about later in the summer that I believe should have been followed, and perhaps a stronger direction of travel in terms of how housing could have been delivered. But that's not to say we haven't delivered housing, because we have. But yeah, I think there's some frustration, let's say, with the way that programme has played out, and there's it's one of the areas, probably always will be an area that any politician or government is going to want to get to grips with as at an early stage.
Because of course, you and I mean, we both, having served in governments, know that housing policy is covered by several departments and agencies of government, which makes it more complicated perhaps than it needs to be, because you have to get all the different parties together at a time when budgets aren't generous. If it's not a core function of a department, it's less likely to receive the priority that perhaps it might. So bringing everyone together seemed to make some degree of sense. What do you think has held things back in relation to that board?
Money would certainly be one. I mean, I think certainly there's people talking about having huge house building programs, but the taxpayer ultimately has only got finite funds in the account, and I think you need to have a clever sort of line of thinking, or a more holistic line of thinking, if you're going to be successful in terms of meeting all the housing needs that we have at the moment. The private sector's clearly got a role to play in that. I think that's why the foundations of, as I said, of this Island Infrastructure Scheme, the amount of apartments that have been built and are being built now will be partly, I think, a testament to the initiatives that government have followed to try and solve the problem. We've tried to relax planning laws appropriately to enable house builders to get on with their building programs, and we can see some of those, the success of some of those now in terms of the estates that have been going up at suitable locations around the island. And I think there has been some progress with local authorities. I'm certainly aware of a couple of examples at least where apartments have been delivered and built and additional housing has been secured, but there's still a huge amount to do. I don't think it's a problem that's necessarily always going to go away, and of course you always have to consider not only the brownfield sites, but how you deal with empty and derelict properties around the island. I think there's still a lot of work potentially that can be done in these areas, but this is not easy policy to solve, and there is complexity with it, and there's also obviously substantial costs with it, and of course you've got to tie that in. I don't think you just deal with it in isolation. Housing clearly has to be part of that economic programme that a government is following and delivering as well.
I suppose, though, if I were someone who was struggling to find a house 5 years ago and I voted for people who I thought were going to make that significant change, listening to what you just said wouldn't give me an awful lot of encouragement, because effectively that's what you expect your politicians to do when they're elected. If they're elected saying we've got a housing crisis and we must sort this problem out, being told 5 years later, well, it's a complex area and it's really quite difficult to sort, mightn't be what they're wanting to hear.
Well, no, I mean, of course, but it's, I think, well, let me take you back 10 years for when 2016, when I became the Treasury Minister. The island had 1,500 people unemployed, or roughly that amount, and we were in negative equity in terms of the people who were leaving the island. In other words, house prices were starting to fall around the island. The economy felt somewhat depressed, and things were almost at the converse side of where they are now. In other words, we've got more people arriving on the island than are leaving. House prices are going up. There is some sense, I appreciate the Chamber of Commerce and GDP figures have yet to be released for the last 2 years, but obviously have clearly contracted and are probably static, I would guess, at best at the moment, maybe slightly up on where they were. So there's a huge amount to do. We have obviously got waiting lists. We've got people finding rented properties. It's not a question of not being able to solve these issues. But for example, when you take rental properties, the government in the last government, there was this threat of the Housing and Rental Act coming through, and I can't remember the exact title of that now, but effectively that would have brought even greater pressure onto the rental market in terms of standards that they would have had to meet. What happened is that people exited the market. So, there are things that we could do. There are policies that can be brought forward that can quite quickly open up certain elements of the market. For example, the rental market. But that's going to have to be, as you say, more cohesive policy making, and the clarity of government's decision making and the funding that is attached to that, particularly if it's going to build government funded properties, needs to be clear, and you've got to obviously balance that out with the overall fiscal situation that the island has in terms of the availability of funding. So when I say it is, I'm not going to shy away from it and pretend it's just easy, because it's not easy. There's finances, there's risk, there's numbers, there's housing allocations, there's housing locations, which are all sometimes tricky positions to solve. But absolutely, you can solve this. We have to some degrees tackled this problem. We have built more houses. We have delivered flexibility in planning. We've got hundreds and hundreds of houses through planning, and we've got hundreds of houses ready to go in the planning system. So, we can develop this. We can overcome this problem, but it does take time, and it does need a proper thought process attached to it and coordination, because otherwise you just run away with the bill, and you could commit hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' funds. You'll be left with a significant and growing housing deficit, and in the end you will probably expose government finances to greater risk. So absolutely difficult. It can be solved, yes. Coordination, part of the answer. Financing, part of the answer. Location, part of the answer.
One of the other board that you established, of course, was the Climate Change Transformation Board, which ultimately ended up getting amalgamated back into, I think it was into DEFRA. It does seem, it certainly, bearing in mind a climate emergency was declared in the previous government in Tynwald, it does seem that government appears to have almost waved the white flag in terms of the green agenda. We don't hear ministers coming on regularly saying, actually, this might be what's being said on social media. There may be people who have concerns about renewable energy projects, but these are the reasons why we need to be pursuing this agenda. That argument seems to have largely been silent.
I think fundamentally, Phil, because actually it all merges into the energy dilemma, and by far, targets and nuances about where we can save fractions of percentages on terms of net zero targets really, I think, pale into insignificance when you look at what we need to do around energy. And arguably, partly, if you can solve that energy dilemma, you're also going to solve, for some people, the targets that have been set and the climate change contribution. So, I think fundamentally the climate change targets, net zero, has really merged itself into the energy transition or the energy dilemma. And look, I think we as an island, I hope at some point, need to unite around the way forward from our energy perspective. I hope will be our energy, sustainable energy, renewable energy, self-generated energy perspective. But as you know, at the moment, that's a divided debate. It's still got some way to go. And I think if we can solve that in terms of setting out the direction forward and seeing some real progress, then for those who are passionate, obviously, about the figures attached to climate change, that will reflect in terms of what our approach to climate change will be in the longer term.
I suggested to Alex Allinson that his contribution to the ongoing inquiry into the Moor Vannon wind farm, that I suggested his remarks were incendiary, in as much as he suggested that there is a clear plan that government has to surround the whole of the island with wind farms. This was a test case. If this works, then everywhere else was going to get something similar. Was he right to say what he said?
I honestly don't think he was right to say what it was, because effectively, I think that was an indication to people that somehow, the council of ministers particularly had some grand plan here, to get a wind farm the size of Moor Vannon up and then capitalise it and put it around the island. And I think he's basing that on some words that were appeared in the economic strategy written by a third-party consultancy, which kind of indicated that the island could make money from supplying renewable energy. Well, of course we could make money supplying renewable energy. Theory, we can also make money from drilling for a gas field. But the reality of it being some sort of forward-thinking government position or a policy papers being discussed by the Council of Ministers is just wrong, I think. And I understand Alex has a view and wanted to promote the Morvannan position or clarify the benefits of the Morvannan position. I just think it was unfair on existing politicians, colleagues in Council of Ministers and things, to suggest that somehow there was some cohesive, coordinated approach to all this. There's not. The Morvannan project should be regarded as a project in isolation for the moment. And clearly, I've been very clear. I understand why there is a lot of concern about this. In fact, I agree with some of the fundamentally, a lot more. Most of the questions that have been put forward, whether that's coming from the group opposed to this, not for IOM, or whether it's been put forward by Manx Wildlife Trust, a lot of people are asking some very valid questions at the moment, and they need to be answered. They need to be recognised as real concerns, and that's what our focus should be. I don't think we should be distracted by talk of potentially gold mines sitting out there in the Irish Sea, because as I indicated when I responded to Alex's comments in a social media post, I just don't think practically that sort of vision is ever really going to work. There's all sorts of connotations with this sort of infrastructure. Most of that has been now addressed in this inquiry, and I think we'll all have to wait and see what these inspectors say, what the inspectors say in October, and whatever. If they say no, they presumably say no, and that will be the end of the story. If, and it's a big if, they say yes, there are concerns that have been raised that need answering, but it is the focus around Morvannan, whereas the position where I believe we shouldn't be drifting this off into arguments about the Isle of Man being surrounded by wind turbines and us all sitting on some sort of whiskey galore fortune, because it's just something that is, highly unlikely, almost impractical, and is not something that is forward in the minds of the Council of Ministers, nor has it ever been put forward formally to us in any sort of capacity, other than having a few sorts of inferences in a third-party economic strategy that was put forward and adopted by Council.
Do you think that the Attorney General's advice to people seeking election to the House of Keys was unwise, or perhaps could have been worded in a different way, because it does feel as though a Crown appointee is trying to silence public debate on something that most people in the Isle of Man seem to have a view on?
I don't think the Attorney General intended to silence public debate. I think the Attorney General was probably right to say, that if you choose to engage on this, and it's not stopping people engaging, it's not going to stop people making declarations, it's just that simply, it makes it difficult for you to be in the Council of Ministers, as a specific, if this application arrives at the door of the Council of Ministers with a yes attached to it, or a yes with caveats. My general point is that, as it is currently structured, Tynwald will have to vote finally on this, and finally on the order that will allow the wind farm to go ahead if it ever reaches that stage. And of course, once it hits the floor of Tynwald in that form, people can express and say exactly what they think in any format. And if a politician chooses to comment and ends up with an Attorney General saying, well, look, I'm afraid I've reviewed those comments. It's going to put you out of the consideration. Well, that's their choice. So I don't think the Attorney General was trying to shut down debate on this. I think the Attorney General was saying, look, politicians and candidates, you go out, you make your own interpretation in terms of discussing things with your constituents. But I must warn you, if you make committed positions or make public statements that give bias towards your decision making, then that may be subsequently challenged if council and ministers choose to support the project, or if council and ministers choose to reject the project. So, it is something that does need consideration, and individuals will have to make that judgment themselves. But to me, personally, it doesn't mean it's up to the individual candidate or the politician whether they choose to declare or not. That declaration probably means that if they put themselves in that position, they will just be unable to consider the details per se. It will not restrict them in Tynwald from saying what they want to say or voting for or against the project ultimately when this order comes through.
Well, we're getting close to the end of the interview now, but I suppose I'll ask you to give us two things about your views about your 5 years as Chief Minister. What's your biggest regret over that 5-year period, and what would you say is the thing you're proudest of in terms of what you've delivered?
So regrets, I've had a few, but then again too few to mention. I mean, there's always regrets. There's always things you think you could have done better. There's always areas that you look back on with hindsight. It's a wonderful thing, isn't it? But you look back on and say, I wish I'd been stronger in that area. Look, I'm proud, of the fact that we took the nation through all this period, right, of turmoil. And when you compare us and benchmark us to many other neighbours, right, and the position that we are in terms of the full employment, 2,500 extra jobs that we've delivered, the brownfield site delivery that we've done, the respite care in terms of the restoration care that we gave after COVID to many people on waiting lists, the way we've had to deal with some very tricky immigration issues, but we've managed to get things tightened up, the way we've dealt with security, the fact this is still one of the safest nations on earth, and certainly safest place, one of the second safest place in Europe, and probably further afield into the world as well. The fact that we've got high net worth investors coming to live on the island, the fact that there's more people coming here than are leaving. I think I'm incredibly proud of getting through some of the most difficult, challenging times, not just as a government but as a nation as well, and the resilience that we've shown in council, in Tynwald and across the island. And you come to at this stage, and this is partly why, of course, after a great deal of thought, I've decided to stand again. But the challenges are going on. I think the platform is there in many areas, though, to address some of these challenges in a strong and purposeful way. That we've taken many issues from the dark ages, if you like, and brought them to the front. And we just talked about energy policy as an example of that, security as an example of that, and where we spend our money next, what we tend to address as priorities, and how the island goes forward will clearly be up to the next government. What I would say is that we've come through those challenges. We should be proud of the resilience shown. We should be proud of the way that we've taken a lot of these challenges on, the way that we've delivered in COVID and through the cost of living challenge, and that we have the foundations now for the island to go forward.
And you are one of those rare things in Manx politics in the last 2 or 3 decades, a Chief Minister who is standing again, standing for election again. Does that give us an indication that perhaps you wouldn't mind another 5 years as Chief Minister?
Well, as always, Phil, that is a matter for my constituents. I've been hugely proud to do the job. I'm very grateful for the support and advice that I've had over 5 tricky years, and I'm very, as I said, I'm proud of the position that we're in at the moment. Despite all the issues that we've got to deal with, I still think there's a lot of things to be proud of on our island and in the community, and I hope that whatever comes next and whoever does come next can now capitalise and take things forward as appropriate.
That was Chief Minister Alf Cannan. So what do you think? Do you feel let down that the bold ambition talked about at the beginning of this administration has not been delivered? Perhaps you acknowledge that choppy international waters have been a significant challenge to navigate. Marks out of 10? Solid progress, or see me after the lesson? For a full list of Keys candidates in Ayr and Michael, visit Manx Radio's website. I'm Phil Gaughan. Thanks for listening.